Welcome to another Sage Real story where we are here with Shruti Shah as part of our Female Founders series. And Shruti is actually extra special because she has segued into venture capital since being a founder. And I'm so excited to share her story with you as part of the series. Shruti is now a partner at Symphonic Capital, but formerly was the founder and COO of YC backed MoveLoot. Thereafter, an entrepreneur in residence at Silicon Valley Bank and Nike before segueing into venture capital. And now her commitment as an investor is to be an empathetic and thoughtful supporter of early stage founders. So really in line with SageLink, you were a founder, you understand truly, and now you are helping and supporting founders. Uh, I'm so happy you're here, Shruti, and I would love for you to start wherever you feel would be a good place. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always a lot of fun to get to talk a little bit about my experience both building a company and now getting to be part of running a fund. Yeah, I'm excited to share some stories today and have a conversation with you about the trials and tribulations, I think, of building a startup.
Yeah. So tell us, when did you form MoveLoot and what was the inception of that like for you?
Yeah, I started MoveLoot with three friends. I was in my early 20s at the time, and I had moved to San Francisco specifically to work for an early stage education technology venture capital fund that's still around today, that does amazing work. And I think, like many early 20 somethings in San Francisco, caught the entrepreneurial bug. It was, I think, maybe in the air in the early 2010s. And I had moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, as had my co founders. We had all sold really mostly IKEA or secondhand furniture that we had purchased in the cities we were living in. We sold it on Craigslist and we basically bought very similar items when we moved to San Francisco. And I think in the process felt like there had been something lost, like there's got to be an easier way to do this in a way that's maybe less wasteful. And so that is kind of the genesis for MoveLoot, which we started in 2013, really by announcing that we were going to build the startup, and we raised $15,000 on an Indiegogo campaign, so crowdfunding, and we took that money and we invested it in a shared warehouse space in the Dog Patch in San Francisco. It was basically like a storage unit, and we rented a bright yellow Penske truck, and we emailed people on Craigslist and told them that we were a new company. We didn't even have a website yet. It was being built, but we would come to their house. We would pick up their kitchen table or their sofa or their side tables or whatever it was, and then we would take it back to our warehouse. We would take a picture of it, upload it to our website, and then we would be responsible for selling the item. And then we'd pass along a sale. And in the early days of MoveLoot, it was us as the drivers picking up this furniture, and we were also the photographers, and we were also cataloging and organizing all the furniture, and then we were reposting all of those items back onto Craigslist to drive traffic to our then very, very rough looking website. And
I
so
love it. I love it.
yeah,
So
I mean, it
scrappy.
very much a startup scrappy startup story.
The people that you bought, I'm just curious, the people that you were taking their furniture and you're like, well, we're gonna try to sell it. What if you didn't sell it? Then
We told them we donated on their behalf, and for the
okay.
vast majority of them, I shouldn't say the vast majority, I think for all of them, it was like, okay, well, as long as you're going to handle this for me, do what you want, basically. And, we were still at the place. I mean, Stripe was in its infancy as a company. The payments options were like Braintree, and maybe that was it. And Stripe was slowly becoming an option for us. But payments processing was a whole other piece to this business that, we needed to be able to do well because we were a consignment business. And so in the early days, we were writing paper checks. We had a checkbook. We would sell a piece of furniture. We would write a check and we put it in the mail, which
Amazing.
is really funny to think about now.
Yeah, for sure. But you got really early traction from what I was reading. Tell
Hmm.
us about that. Like you launched on whatever date, and then how long did it take to get some significant traction?
Yeah, we launched, I think, in either late August or early September of 2013. Early October, the website was live. We were generating revenue. I think by November or December of that year, we were bringing in a few $1,000s a week in revenue and growing fairly steadily. We also applied to Y Combinator and learned that we were going to be joining this winter batch, which was the time winter of 2014, maybe a month into launching the business. And so it was like November of 2013. And I think that really changed the game for us. We were very young, very inexperienced founders, and YC gave us a lot of the process and structure that we needed where you're thinking about consistent week over week or month over month growth that would ultimately help you tell a story to a prospective investor that would allow you to raise more significant capital, which I think we were becoming fairly, very aware very quickly that we were going to need some significant capital to be able to scale this business.
Right. And so backing up just a step to get into YC is exceedingly hard. For many founders listening will know that, but for those that don't,
Yeah, I'll caveat it by saying I think we got into YC a decade ago, right? So this was 2014 or 2013, so now almost 11 years ago, and I think it was still hard. Like it was definitely still an achievement, but I know the batches have just gotten increasingly competitive. I think YC has become a bigger and bigger name. But for us, it was just such a valuable experience, both because we got customers out of it. I mean, our YC, fellow YC benchmates were many of our first customers, and also because it really allowed us to build, I think, a network in the Valley that we maybe wouldn't have been able to build otherwise.
sure. And who was on the team at this point? What team entered YC? Who was your early team?
So I had three co-founders, Jenny, Bill, and Ryan, and we all had very different jobs. Bill was the CEO, I was the COO. Jenny has a marketing background, so she was the CMO, and Ryan is an engineer, so he was our CTO. Made a lot of sense because you don't see teams of four co-founders all that often, but I think in our case, we all have very different skill sets, and this is a business that had a lot of complexity, and so it was helpful to have people that had kind of pretty specialized areas of expertise. Although I guess CEO and COO, you kind of have more generalized expertise, but Jenny and Ryan had very specific expertise. And we had like a couple part-time, I think maybe we had hired, once we got into YC, we hired somebody to support Ryan on the engineering side. And uh, we had a couple of folks that worked in the warehouse, but it was a very lean team. We started outsourcing the pickup and delivery at some point because the volume got to be too large and we needed to be in the warehouse to be able to organize things. And so we eventually worked with moving companies or 3PLs that would just do the pickup and delivery for us, which isn't the model that we scaled with. But in the short term, given that we had a little bit of cash, it made more sense to outsource that function so that we could focus on getting the warehouse operation right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. And that's a strong team. And I think YC really looks at team. That's why I asked. I think it's a super
Yeah.
important component in their measurement and analysis. So were you all just all in? Were you postgraduates? Talk a little about that just for a second, because I think that's a hard jump for especially female founders to leave maybe a secure job or a secure path and jump into a startup.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I was probably also the most hesitant to jump head first. I had been a teacher before, and then I had this venture capital job, and I think I had interviewed maybe for another role at Google, and um, I was like, is this really what I want to do? And I can remember sitting down one day and making a list, a pro con list, like what are the pros of doing this versus pursuing a more traditional path. And the conclusion that I ultimately came to was that the opportunity, and I think this has guided a lot of my decision making since, in terms of the way that I just even have thought about my career, is what will this opportunity present in terms of what I'm going to learn and the skills that I'm going to develop that I may not get if I follow a more traditional path. And I think also being the age that I was, I did feel like, okay, look, I can give myself a deadline. Can we pay ourselves in 6 months? Can we pay ourselves in, what's the end? When does the money run out for me personally in terms of actually being able to do this? But also, what will ultimately happen if this doesn't work? And so I kind of played that scenario through my brain and was like, if this doesn't work, the worst thing that happens is I go back and get that job at Google or Meta or whatever. And the best thing that happens is that I learn a ton in the process and I can use them to help guide where I want to go next. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's what you have to think about. Now, I think there are other complexities. If I was, doing it at the age that I am now, I might have a different set of considerations in terms of just, I think, even my own comfort level with the life that I've been able to build post MoveLoot. But when you're 24 and the options on the table are go build a startup, and you have the privilege and the runway, the personal runway to be able to do that, you don't have anything to lose. Like the worst thing that happens is it doesn't work.
Right.
Um,
I think that's brilliant though, is like taking a very pragmatic approach and like setting yourself clear goals ahead of time. Like, okay, if I'm not making money by a certain date, I'm gonna call it, and I can not pay myself for so long. And you know, also I think something that weighs in is how can I abandon this dream? And what does that path look like? I go down, I don't take this risk. Am I gonna really regret this? And
the one thing I would add too, right? And I think about this a lot now. I don't know that I was all that conscious of it then, but, and this might be I don't intend it to be a self-important thing to say, but I think 9 times out of 10, if you're given the opportunity to bet on yourself, it's worth taking the risk, because I think oftentimes we, you know, are very much thinking about the perception, or, what other people will think, or is it prestigious enough, all of these things. But I've actually never, not like in every situation where I've been myself, I've learned more um, about myself, about what I'm capable of, about what I'm interested in than I think I ever would have in any other situation.
that's great. And it's also about trusting yourself too. I think I was listening to a very short podcast that you did or an interview, and I think you spoke about really trusting yourself as a founder being really important. And I think it goes along with that. So you take this jump, you get into YC, you're moving along, and did you, the whole I think premise of YC is to connect you then to some significant funding. How did that look for you?
So we had been able to tell a growth story during YC that basically said, look, the business is growing out of control and we're at a standstill because we need more space. We're a space constrained business, and we have a lease lined up that we need to get signed, but we can't sign the lease until we have investors, because the um, the owner of the building would not allow it. And so we had these proof points that we had this thing, that we figured this thing out, and we needed the money to help us keep moving. And
Hmm.
that was really how we built the story of our round. We can tell you this great growth story, but like we are actually constrained. Our growth is constrained unless we raise capital. And it worked. So we raised a $2.8 billion seed round coming out of YC, which at the time was a very large seed round. Now
Yeah.
I know people raise even larger seed rounds, but that really, I think, was game changing for us, because it really allowed us to start to build a team, to hire more talent. And we also wanted to test the business in another market. We were a marketplace. Marketplaces always have supply and demand challenges. And what we realized pretty quickly about our business was that we were always going to be a supply constrained business. Used furniture is a unique item. People are looking for a very specific thing. And so even if you have 100 green sofas, we might not have the green sofa that you are specifically looking for. And so we were always thinking about ways to grow supply, because it would allow us to be able to serve more customers. And so with that, we actually ended up setting up shop once we raised our seed round in North Carolina, because Bill and I have a connection here. We both went to college here. He grew up in North Carolina, and North Carolina is the furniture capital of the United States. And so what we realized pretty quickly is that not only is this a problem for the individual consumer, but for a lot of retailers and manufacturers, many of which had headquarters or offices in High Point, North Carolina, which for a long time had been a hub for furniture manufacturing. They needed a way to get rid of their excess inventory that wasn't just liquidation. So what we offered that a liquidator didn't was more money than a liquidator would offer, and also the ease of getting it to the customer, because they could drop ship the stuff either directly to the customer, or they could send it to our warehouse where we'd store it and we would send it off on their behalf. So I would say that the seed round was really pivotal in helping us grow. And it also kind of paved the way. I think very quickly thereafter, I think we closed the seed round in I want to say late spring of 2014. By December or January of the next year of 2015, we had closed our Series A.
Okay. Getting you to a Series A, that's really tough. Like, what do you think you all did right? What was something that you would recommend to other founders that you learned through the journey?
Gosh, the things we did right. I think I so often reflect on all the things we did wrong,
Yeah.
but I guess we did do a couple things right. I think the things that we did right, I think were really around understanding some of the supply and demand dynamics of the business, and really uh, figuring out what our growth channels were. I mentioned that in the early days, we were kind of building this business on Craigslist. Well, as you might imagine, that was good for about 6 months. And then Craigslist figured us out. And also, it just wasn't a sustainable channel for us. It was a great channel in major cities. Craigslist has different dynamics in different markets, but we had to figure out, what is actually the way to get the word out about us. And we needed kind of both a brand strategy. How do we build brand awareness, but also think about, is there a digital marketing spend play here? Is there a referral play? What we realized pretty quickly was that the experience that we had created was so unique and special, mostly because this concept of I have this sofa and I would just like somebody to deal with it. And then 3 weeks later, I'm going to get a check in the mail or money deposited into my bank account for this thing that I did no work to try to sell was a really compelling value proposition. And so I think that is really what drove a lot of the growth of the business, because people would tell their friends about it. I think until the day that, MoveLoot was no longer around, we were still hearing from folks that they'd heard about us through, a friend who'd moved cross country, or they heard about us.
Yeah. So early product market fit, it sounds like,
Yes.
really. So customers didn't have to pay you to pick up their stuff. They at all. So it was really just a value add for them if they got that check. Worst case scenario, someone picked up theirs. Because 1-800 got junk charges an obscene amount of money.
Yeah. I mean, we had to get clear too about like, are we going to take everything? Are we not going to take everything? And so we ended up not taking everything because I think, we want to make sure we could sell it. Otherwise, we
Yeah.
were sitting on inventory that wasn't sellable. But these were all learnings along the way. Who knows? I mean, maybe there would be a world one day where we would charge people for junk removal if we were still around today, because not everything that people own is able to be resold.
Yeah. And so did you raise your Series A?
We did. We raised a Series A, and then we ended up raising another round shortly thereafter, about 2 months later, that I guess was effectively a Series B, because we had seen so much growth.
What was the end of MoveLoot? What happened? And what
Yeah.
did you learn? Obviously, you know, it, it got acquired. What do you think happened, and what would you have done differently?
Yeah. I would do a million things differently. But some of that I think is age and maybe wisdom, and also understanding a little bit more about how you manage people and lead teams and lead organizations. So to answer your first question, what happened with MoveLoot is that I think we were victims. Victim is a strong word. I think we were growing at a time when a lot of startups that had raised a lot of capital were being coached to spend ahead of growth, which meant that we were spending a lot of money on marketing to try to grow our business at a very fast clip. The challenge with that is that when you are focused on growth, you are less focused on your unit economics. And in the event that the macro environment changes, the funding environment changes, the tune of many of your investors will change to the tune of, we are concerned about the possibility of you raising future capital. So maybe you can focus on profitability instead, so that you can prove that the unit economics of this business work, thus making it easier for you to raise more capital. So we raised a lot of capital very quickly. And I think our investors at the time felt like, we gave you this money, spend it. And then in 2015, the macro funding environment changed. The Chinese economy tanked, and there were a lot of investors who were running funds who all of a sudden felt like, will I be able to raise future capital for my fund, which has a downstream impact on startups, which meant that the common advice that we were then getting in the boardroom was, okay, actually, let's not spend all this money. Let's save money, focus on profitability, cut costs where you can, and, make sure you understand the unit economics. So actually, we did that, and it was hard. We had grown to a team of over 300, and we had physical operations in like 6 or 7 different cities. And so we laid off a ton of people, and we worked really hard on getting our unit economics right, basically unit profitable in a lot of our markets. And the next hurdle would have been to be overall profitable as a company. Late 2015, early 2016, we had another meeting with our board, and there was, I think, yet again some fear that even though we were now on this path to profitability, that we actually needed to figure out how to grow again, because we
Right.
raised all this capital, we need to be able to raise more money. And I refer to this as kind of the dark side of venture capital, because I don't, we weren't the only company that experienced this, and we were fortunate to raise the money that we did. And I think what people don't realize is that venture is growth capital. And so if you are not able to sustain the growth that your investors need to see, then you either become irrelevant or dead, or no longer a priority, and your ability to raise future capital can be harmed as well. And so we actually had a number of conversations about what to do, and the decision that we came to with our board was to change the business model. So no longer would we be storing the furniture. Instead, you would store the furniture, and we would outsource the pickup and delivery to a third party logistics company. And if and when the item sold, we would send that truck to your house. It would pick up the item. It would then coordinate the delivery with the seller. But the value prop was completely different. And I think one of the things that we maybe didn't, perhaps that we underestimated, I think, is how, when we talked about early product market fit, how much our customers loved us. And about 50% of our buyers are repeat buyers, and about 60% of our sellers are repeat sellers. And people loved the experience that we had built. So when we introduced a brand new one and said, hey, that old experience doesn't exist anymore, it alienated a lot of customers in favor of acquiring a new one. But that would also imply that we knew the right strategy at that point to acquire those new customers. And I think we've been so focused on pivoting the product and trying to negotiate out of leases and getting our team back to a place where everyone felt ready to tackle this new challenge, that we just didn't. And this was a customer that we didn't know as well, that we hadn't found product market fit with. And at the same time as all of this, you had Facebook Marketplace
I was
launching,
going
you
to
had
say,
Offer Upletting launching, you had Let Go launching, all of which had very similar value propositions. And so I think
right.
for us, it felt like a big hill to climb, especially for a
Mhm.
company that was as late stage as we were. We were doing double digit annual revenues. And so all of a sudden that revenue dropped pretty substantially. So it was almost like we were a seed stage business again. So we had some investors that really tried to invest again and help us rebuild. And we all just felt like that wasn't very fair, because there were too many unknowns, and we put everybody through a lot. And we ended up just kind of selling a piece of the business, but it wasn't a crazy startup outcome. It was a wild ride in a very short period of time.
Mhm.
But back to the conversation we had earlier around like what you have to lose. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a lot to lose, I guess, but I gained so much in doing it, and I think it's allowed me to have the career that I have now.
Hindsight is 2020, and that's what I love about SageLink is that, you know, women starting out have this incredible resource, other women that have lived these experiences. So, if you could go back in time to that point where, you're just in the growth mindset and now you have this incredible insight too as an investor, what would you have done differently with the business model,
Oh, it's a
I
great
guess?
question. I mean, I think I debated this with my co-founders too. I think there's a world where we would have raised less money or raised a different type of capital. I think we built a business in San Francisco in the early 2010s. The way that we learned, you know, thought you had to build a business was by taking venture. And I say this now as a venture capitalist, but there are many ways to build a business. And I think there is a possibility that we would have been more successful if we had thought about a different way. I think the other thing is that we could have raised less money and really focused in one or two markets, got our unit economics exactly right, and then gone out to raise more money. I think the third thing I'll say is like, and this is like a very personal thing for a lot of founders, is I think we should have trusted our guts more. Um, I think for all of us, the rate of growth, the pace at which the business was moving was at times too much. And I think we all felt it. And I think there were times where we wanted to push back. And because we were young, because we knew that we didn't have a ton of experience, we looked to our investors. They, their incentive is to give everybody the same advice, which is grow as fast as you can, build a big business. And, in their case, one of those companies needs to work out. And I think this is particularly apparent for later stage investors where they need to see those multiples much faster. I think at the early stage, you know that you're going to be in it for the long run. And so you're not as pushy about growth as you might be if you were a later stage investor. So that is one, I think, of my deepest regrets is just this idea of being able to really voice a feeling or an opinion about what might be right for the business. And I tell our founders now, I want to be a thought partner with you in building your company. And I've seen a lot of stuff and I might have an idea about how to solve a problem. But at the end of the day, you are running your company. So you could ask five different people and they might give you five different answers. And your job as the entrepreneur, I think excellent entrepreneurs do this well, is to take all those inputs and sit with your thoughts and make a decision that feels right to you, given that you have limited data, but you are closest to the business. It's a hard thing to know at 24 that and to acknowledge that maybe your instincts are right and you need to speak up about them when you're the youngest and maybe the least intelligent person in the room.
Right, and that's what I was just gonna ask you is, it's amazing that you have that mindset as an investor, but what advice do you have for founders to doing that, to trusting your gut and to then coming back to investors and saying like, "Thank you, but no thank you for that advice."
Yeah, it's really tough. But I do really believe strongly that the best investors, if you come back to them and say, I really appreciate your point of view, and actually, this is the direction that I think we need to go for these reasons. Like, I've sat with it for a while, I've thought about all of these options, and I think this is the best path forward. No one's going to tell you not to do that unless they're, an activist investor or there's something very peculiar about them. But I think
Mhm.
particularly early stage investors are very good about listening to founder inputs because the reality is I'm not in the day to day with any of our portfolio companies. I get to hear snippets or snapshots of things that are going on. I get to ask questions about those dynamics, but I'm not close enough to any of these businesses to know what the 100% right decision is. And frankly, as a founder, you might not know what the 100% right decision is either, but you have a gut instinct because you've been able to build what you built so far. And so I think sometimes it's also about learning to trust yourself and trust that you're capable of making good and sometimes hard decisions. And that's also not something that comes naturally. I mean, it's not something that always came naturally to me or easy to me. I think, also I think sometimes as women, we have people pleasing genes that make it even
Totally.
more difficult. Like,
Yeah.
you feel like you can't say no because you can do it all. And
Yeah,
so,
and imposter
yeah.
syndrome comes into play a lot
Hmm.
for women, and if you don't really have that solid trust. The new Bumble CEO, Lydia Ann Jones, actually speaks a lot about this as one thing, that just has really helped her is that trust in just trusting herself. It was a big game changer for her. Any tips on
Completely.
how to do that?
I mean, therapy helps.
No,
I
it's
think, but I think
setting
anything that gets you out of your head and
yeah,
maybe into your body a little bit
yeah,
more. Exercise. I do a lot of yoga, breath work. I think,
yeah.
and these are all obviously like very tangible things. But I think
Mhm.
you putting yourself in situations too where you have to trust yourself, and that might be a physical situation, right? Skiing, for example, is a good one, or
Mhm.
and that's why I think athletic activity comes to mind, just because in those situations, you are in control, or I don't know, maybe control is an illusion, but you think you're in control. And I really think I think that is a great testing ground for continuing to figure out how to trust yourself and trust your decision making and feel confident about your ability to do things. I think it's kind of figuring out what works for you. And there's maybe a physical manifestation of learning to trust yourself. But I think also spending time reflecting, journaling, getting to the root of, what is it about the way I feel about myself, and, what am I struggling with? And really approaching building a business with a self-reflective attitude, I think is often a key to feeling like you can get better and better at making good decisions. I think if you're not giving yourself space to self-reflect as a leader of an organization, that you often aren't taking the time to understand where you might fall short or where there are areas for improvement. The self-reflection helps you become more aware of who you are and what you're good at. And I think that then just further aligns you with your ability, like you become more of you. I feel like the older I've gotten, the more time I've taken the time to do reflection or therapy or even some of these kind of physical activities, the more I feel like myself. I feel like I know who I am and I know what I'm capable of. And I'm also very aware of what I don't know, increasingly aware of what I don't know and where I might need help or support in making a decision.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense because then it's like the abyss of the unknown, is gone. You're not just getting kind of paralyzed in, what am I? Can I do this? You're sort of tracking who you are and what you're able to do. And I think and all that self-work is so important. And I hear over and over leaders say that. You are now an investor coaching startups. The last thing I'll ask you is for female founders listening to your story and to this episode, what's a piece of advice that you would give, just either that you personally learned or that you see from the companies that you are supporting? Anything that
There's
stands
a
out?
lot.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked a little bit about this idea of trusting your gut,
Hmm.
and I think um, that's something that I feel like I say a lot to people is like I can ask a lot of questions, but at the end of the day, what does your gut say? Doesn't mean our guts are always right, but your gut is usually indicating that you need to be thinking about something in a particular way, and it's important to listen to. It's an important data point, I guess you could say. The other thing I'd say is that I really think that all company building is effectively an experiment. And I'd say that until you're a well-established corporation. And I think all too often we become obsessed with perfection, and the product needs to be exactly right. The service needs to be exactly right. Like, I can't ship this until it's perfect. And the reality of an early stage startup is that it is one giant experiment. And I think one thing I say to a lot of founders is if you were a scientist, if you had a lab, how would you approach this differently? I think we can become paralyzed. And I get it, because what you're doing is you're putting a part of you, something you believe in, that you've created, that you want people to appreciate. You're putting that out into the world. I mean, in the way that an artist is putting out a piece of art into the world. And that is a vulnerable and scary thing to do. And the only way that ever gets scale, the only way that ever becomes something that is truly impactful is by having a willingness to put it out there, know that it's imperfect, and know that you might fail 100 times before you get it right.
Powerful. Really, really insightful. Shruti, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to share
Yeah.
your insight with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Join our network of real women and real wisdom at sagelink.com, SAYGELINK.